registrar is more likely to move a class with only 2 people than if it's 30 people. Because it's only 2 people you have to move. But you said on Facebook that like information.
Oh,
We go ahead and get started. So today I had the pleasure of introducing Gökçe Günel, who's a sabbatical fellow with us at the Crown Center, coming to us from the anthropology department at Rice University, which she just joined after being an assistant professor at Arizona and then completing her PhD at Cornell. She's just been a fantastic resource for us at the Crown Center. We just finished our retreat where our postdocs and other scholars present research in progress. Her experience publishing this book and promoting this book has been invaluable. And I'll say personally, I just came back from a series of conversations about environmental activism in the Middle East. And it's easy to dismiss bottom-up environmental activism or state attempts to deal with climate, to deal with the challenges of climate change in the Middle East, parts of which some people predict will soon become uninhabitable. And Masdar City, which is often held up as the model project for this, is easy to dismiss as a quote-unquote mirage in the desert. This book will make you rethink the mirage and understand it in quite different terms that perhaps shows more consistency than deviation. Before we begin, though, I'd like to remind everyone that we'll go until 1:30. The speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, then we'll have Q&A. And you are being recorded. It will not be posted online, but just so everyone's aware that the talk is being recorded. So without further ado,
Thank you so much for your introduction, David, and thank you for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. And so today I'll be speaking broadly about the construction of a smart eco-city in oil-rich Abu Dhabi called Masdar City. And the talk draws on my book, Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, which was published earlier this year by Duke University Press. And here I'm not going to summarize the book in full or give you the full sense of its structure, but rather share sort of some of the arguments I make in the book. And I'd be happy to talk more about sort of the larger project in the Q&A. So the past decades have seen the consolidation of climate change and energy scarcity as significant problems which need to be mitigated and governed. International institutions have started taking steps to limit greenhouse gas emissions while promoting efficient and clean energy use. At the same time, as we know, many communities have begun planning for climate change impacts that might be unavoidable, such as sea level rise, and we see some of this kind of planning in Boston as well. So in responding to the dual problem of future energy scarcity and climate change, Abu Dhabi, the wealthiest emirate of the UAE, began branding itself as a leader in green innovation. In the year 2006, the Abu Dhabi government publicized its intentions to invest in renewable energy and clean technology in the form of a multifaceted state-owned company called Mazda, hoping to ensure that the emirate remains a significant player in the energy industry well after its oil reserves run dry or become less valuable. In the following years, Masdar, meaning source in Arabic, became widely known for Masdar City, a futuristic smart eco-city that was designed by the London-based architecture office Foster & Partners to rely entirely on renewable energies. Masdar City would house 50,000 residents and 40,000 commuters on a 600-hectare area and cost $22 billion. The site neighbored the Abu Dhabi airport, the Yas Marina Formula One circuit, and the Al Ghazal golf course. To look at computer-generated images of it, you might think it was a fantasy from a sci-fi comic, the sort I read as a boy, Norman Foster of Foster & Partners said in 2011. But Masdar City, a university city and an environmental technology park outside Abu Dhabi, is already being built. And here you can see the computer rendering of the Masdar City master plan, which was heavily publicized in the years between 2007 and 2011 and appeared in many different kinds of publications. So while the eco-city was central to Mazda's vision, Mazda also invested in renewable energy via its other operations, so Mazda Power, Mazda Carbon, and Mazda Capital. Mazda Institute, the Renewable Energy Research Center that was founded by MIT, and openly decided fledgling eco-city, started offering fully funded graduate degrees to about 200 students from around the world. So during the time of my fieldwork in 2010 and 2011, these students who went to Mazda Institute were the only inhabitants of Mazda City, so living in dormitories on campus. So they featured heavily in my research. So, and here's an image of the Mazda Institute dorms and labs situated at the center of Mazda City. So, Spaceship in the Desert maps and analyzes the production of Abu Dhabi's renewable energy and clean technology infrastructure centering on the Mazda project and seeks to understand how an oil-rich emirate like Abu Dhabi prepares for a future with less oil. And I conducted research for this project at Mazda as well as at MIT and at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Bonn. And the research demonstrates that Abu Dhabi's clean technology projects have aimed to generate what I call in the book technical adjustments, a means for vaulting over to a future where humans will continue to enjoy technological complexity without interrogating existing social, political, and economic relations. So in effect, I understand technical adjustments as imaginative and wide-ranging responses to global climate change and energy scarcity, which open up certain interventions, such as extending technological complexity, while foreclosing others, such as asking larger-scale moral, ethical, and political questions about regarding how to live. So while producing innovative and at times fun artifacts, technical adjustments eventually obfuscate and efface the simple realization that humans cannot continue to live and consume as they do. Instead, technical adjustments seek to preserve and conserve the status quo. So before I continue further, I'll give a very brief historical account of Abu Dhabi, although I'm not sure if this audience really needs this, but I'll go ahead and do that anyway. So in the early 1960s, while still under British control, Abu Dhabi commanded around 10% of the world's proven hydrocarbon deposits. However, under the rule of Sheikh Shahput, often remembered for not fully complying with British interests, Abu Dhabi refused development interventions. And in this image, you can see Sheikh Shahput photographed in 1963 by Roger Crane, a Life magazine photographer. But Sheikh Zayed, who came to power with British support in 1966, drastically transformed policies during his rule that lasted until his death in 2004, prioritizing oil concessions and contracts. Sheikh Zayed was also a critical actor in founding what is now known as the UAE in 1971, bringing together 7 different independent sheikdoms that had previously been part of a British protectorate called the Trucial States. And so as you see in this map, Abu Dhabi, which is the capital of the UAE, is also the largest emirate in the Union. And Dubai, which is more famous, more well-known emirate, is neighbors of Abu Dhabi. By the 1990s, Abu Dhabi accounted for over 90% of the UAE's oil exports and had the capacity to pump 2.5 million barrels per day. After Sheikh Zayed's death in 2004, his successor Sheikh Khalifa began to mold a more globally competitive image for Abu Dhabi, and by specifically investing in high-profile development projects in the fields of tourism, urban transformation, and technology transfer. So some of these projects, such as the construction of MIA Abu Dhabi, Guggenheim, and Louvre, received attention globally, and here's an image of the new Louvre Museum, which opened in November 2017. It's useful to keep in mind, however, that foreign labor designs, builds, and manages these projects. So of the 9 million people who live and work in the UAE, almost 8 million are not Emirati citizens. So these immigrants come to the UAE on temporary renewable work contracts sponsored by their employers. Some of them hold white-collar jobs in sectors such as tourism, finance, and construction, while many of them are low-wage male workers from South Asia and Southeast Asia. The UAE's violation of workers' rights, especially on construction sites of large projects such as Guggenheim and MIA Abu Dhabi, are well documented by international institutions as well as the media. Today, Abu Dhabi continues to rely on various networks of oil for expanding into the renewable energy and clean technology sectors and seeks to start exporting knowledge-intensive products rather than oil. The practices adopted in promoting clean energy, such as the construction of Mazda City, are meant to transform Abu Dhabi's image from oil producer to technology developer, rendering the emirate, as one of my interlocutors put it, more elite. In this context, climate change and future energy scarcity have emerged as business opportunities. When defining their understandings of renewable energy, many of my interlocutors who came to Abu Dhabi from all over the world explained that they did not advocate closing down businesses and stopping production. Just the opposite. So they imagined Mazda as a test bed that would create more business potential for Abu Dhabi. They did not aspire to surrender or challenge capitalist consumerism, which is often seen as the reason for dwindling resources and climate vulnerability, but instead attempted to generate a strategic, holistic, comprehensive approach to renewable energy. The producers of Mazda City accordingly remarked that their initiative was not environmentalism, and that the project did not seek to be located outside the present social, political, and economic conditions. In addition to admitting that not many of them would self-identify as environmentalists, clean technology professionals in different sectors found it significant to highlight how the environment was a sexy part of the economy, and therefore could be integrated into existing models of social and political life seamlessly. Like many businesses around the world, they could supply environmentally friendly products that could perhaps supplant the demand for non-green products such as fossil fuels. So in the rest of this talk, I'd like to analyze the imagery employed in speaking about the futuristic Mazda City project in the years that followed its launch in 2006. Why and how did Mazda become conceptualized as a city of the future, and what did it mean for the project to be located at another time, in addition to being located within a bounded area in the desert, often conceptualized as an other space? What, or perhaps when, was the future imagined through Mazda City? So I'll explore the spatial and temporal discourses and mechanisms that were put to use while planning and building the eco-city, and ask, how did the residents of Mazda City understand the labor involved in producing a green city in the middle of the desert in an oil-producing country? A celebrated commentary regarding the futuristic aspects of Mazda City came from Laura's blog, where she emphasized how being there felt like living in a spaceship in the middle of the desert. Laura, an American student in her mid-20s, had moved to Abu Dhabi from the US with an ambition to learn about renewable energy and clean technology at the new Mazda Institute, having received her bachelor's degree from a small college in Massachusetts. In September 2010, after publishing her blog, Laura received unexpected attention from journalists around the world. The president of the Institute and many other media, for instance, like the Guardian newspaper, recalled Laura's blog when reporting on developments at Mazda. Laura had a studio apartment on the new campus and had assumed her blog would reach a handful of friends and family members. She later searched for reasons as to why and how it had become so popular. In Laura's understanding, the Mazda Institute campus became an innovative technological model, proposing a means of survival based on rational scientific management. The spaceship would conserve life as it had long been known on Earth, presenting a provisional solution to an uninhabitable environment outside. In this way, the spaceship would act as an ark, an artificial interior space expected to give birth to a next generation of resource pioneers. The spaceship would signify enclosure, archiving, selection, hierarchy, movement, and most importantly, the maintenance of strict boundaries between interior and exterior spaces. The experimental hub of another time and another space would technologically maintain the lives and livelihoods of its residents indoors. Since the 1960s, space travel technologies have inspired ecologically sensitive architecture, producing a blueprint for survival in a context of rising environmental concerns. As historians of science such as Peder Anker and Sabine Höhler have noted in their overviews of ecological design developments, the American space program of the 1960s had considerable impact on the ways in which designers imagined and planned eco-friendly life on Earth. Buildings would constitute self-regulating and decentralized systems with comfortable climatic conditions for humans, provide enclosed shelters for an impending ecological disaster, and serve as means of escape from possible destruction on Earth. And this is perhaps best symbolized by the well-known Biosphere 2 project, where in the fall of 1991, 8 scientists entered the glass and steel complex in the Sonoran Desert in Oracle, Arizona, about an hour outside Tucson, to test whether they could sustain their lives in a sealed environment, with the hopes that the model would someday be replicated to colonize outer space. Occupying buildings inspired by space technologies, humanity would behave like astronauts with clear outer space missions. In these histories, the spaceship is a finite, technically sophisticated, and insular habitat for an exclusive group of beings facing an outside world of crises. In his book Shipwreck with Spectator, Hans Blumenberg explains how humans prefer in their imagination to represent their overall condition in the world in terms of a sea voyage. The idea of the spaceship, much like the submarine that preceded it, then serves as an extension of the art metaphor, demonstrating the inevitable boundaries of human activities, vilifying the space beyond human habitability, and producing the outside as a vacuum that should not be inhabited. As seas full of mythical monsters surround the livable environments on Earth, the ship provides a safe interior space thanks to its strict boundaries. Or, as the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk suggests, it acts as an autonomous, absolute, context-free house, the building with no neighborhood. This way, the ship puts forward an alternative environment of peace and rationality, standing in opposition to the destructive and irrational crises on Earth. In prioritizing enclosure for some over collective survival, which is the tension that underpins most spacefaring movies, this spaceship also advances the principles of selection and endorses what Sloterdijk calls exclusivity dressed up as universalism. Despite saving only a very small number of those who suffer a metaphorical shipwreck, the spaceship insists on addressing the planetary scale questions of survival in the unknown, the sustenance of the species beyond ecological catastrophe, and the preservation of an existing civilization, albeit in highly limited and confined form. And here are the first scientists who lived in Biosphere 2, and if you're interested, there are many stories about how their journey came to an end, and many controversies around why the project had to be stopped. So I'm not going to go into that here, but I'd recommend that you check it out. So Mazda City was conceived to perform the role of a spaceship in the desert, to maintain the lives and livelihoods of its residents by relying on renewable energy and clean technologies. Architects working with Foster and Partners based at the Mazda City site to monitor both the design of Mazda Institute and the sustenance of the Mazda City Master Plan suggested that the ecological mandate assisted Norman Foster, founder and chairman of Foster and Partners, as he produced his legacy, having himself been inspired by the history of ecological architecture in the 1960s and the 1970s. One of the on-site Foster and Partners architects told me, Norman wants to be the Bucky Fuller of this century. Buckminster Fuller was a multidimensional, somewhat eccentric 20th century inventor who attempted to resolve the global problems of housing, transport, education, and energy through his innovative design and writing projects. He conceived of the Earth as a beautifully designed spaceship that lacks comprehensible instructions, which he sought to provide in publishing in 1969 Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. We're all astronauts, in Fuller's assertion. We've not been seeing our spaceship Earth as an integrally designed machine which, to be persistently successful, must be comprehended and serviced in total. In learning to successfully operate spaceship Earth and its complex life-supporting and regenerating systems, humankind was confronted with the challenge of self-instruction. Earth was an operable technological object, fully accessible to humankind. Fuller not only wrote about his technocratic understandings of Earth, but also conceived many design and engineering projects to illustrate his philosophy, such as the geodesic dome, a latticed and shell structure that is able to withstand a very heavy load for its size, and that can be used for quick and lightweight housing projects around the world. As a young architect, Norman Foster met Buckminster Fuller in 1971 to collaborate on the construction of the Samuel Beckett Theatre at Oxford. The theatre, which was never built, marked the beginning of their 12-year relationship, which involved several more collaborative projects that never materialized. The theatre would have been a subterranean building designed to house classrooms and exhibition spaces for St. Peter's College, and it would have utilized the geodesic lightweight structures that made Fuller famous by then. And this is another image of the theatre building. Foster claims that this plan had a significant impact on the later stages of his own career. I remember that Bucky made the comparison with a submarine because the structure of the building had to be resistant to water like a seaworthy vessel. The building had to stand up to groundwater and other natural underground forces, so it's no coincidence that my later underground projects also take the form of ships and submarines. The metaphor of the ship or the submarine continues to inform Foster's design work. For instance, a 2009 article in the Guardian newspaper suggested that Foster's reassuringly technical, graceful, silver, white, and immaculate designs would be suitable for architecture on the moon. And more recently, in 2015, Foster and partners publicized renderings for a settlement on Mars, which would be constructed by robots prior to the arrival of humans. Designing for extraterrestrial environments provides an exciting platform for experimentation that's at the front line of innovative technology, one of Foster's partners commented. And this is the rendering I was talking about, so you can see what the imagination of outer space looks like. So, in relation to his recent design projects for outer space, Foster has noted that he understands practicing architecture in the Arabian Gulf to be similar to lunar exploration. And news commentators have supported this take on in their continued fascination with the idea of constructing an eco-friendly city in the desert. The inhospitable terrain suggests that the only way to survive here is with the maximum of technological support, a bit like living on the moon. In his autobiography, the leading Emirati entrepreneur and businessman Isa Gurg also touches upon space exploration and asserts that Emirati rulers understand the desert as a moonscape. He describes how Sheikh Rashid of Dubai dismissed the moon landing as a hoax, arguing that the pictures from the moon's surface on television had obviously been filmed in the mountains of Ras Al Khaimah, one of the 7 emirates that make up the UAE. In December 2010, Fred Mohammadzadeh, then president of Mazda Institute, appeared in a CNN documentary by Richard Quest about Mazda City. He explained that when the US wanted to send a man to the moon, it produced NASA. And now, when the UAE wants to transform and diversify its economy, it builds Mazda City. So how can we conceptualize and understand the impetus to compare Mazda City with the moon landing or with an exploratory trip to outer space? Looking back at the Apollo space program, David Mindell, a historian of science, explains how President John F. Kennedy seized and mobilized the powerful mythology of the frontier in aiming for the moon. The term frontier, originally meaning border or borderline, took on new resonance during the settlement of the American West in the 18th and 19th centuries. In this narrative, heroic pioneers headed to an unknown geography full of unpredictable dangers. There, they would make use of self-control and self-reliance to open up a new resource frontier. Laura's spaceship analogy also helped the producers of Mazda City in promoting the reconfiguration of the desert as an undiscovered resource frontier from which a novel means of livelihood would emerge. The analogy served as a conceptual extension of the multiple Orientalist projects that the British or the French undertook in the 19th century in order to make a certain form of life possible in the arid geographies of Arabia. Many colonialist and settler colonialist projects have regarded the desert as this blank or ruined space which can be fixed with the help of technology and proper governance. So as Diana Davis shows in her book, The Arid Lands, European colonizers have conceptualized the desert as a geography that has been generated due to misuse by its native peoples and therefore needs to be enhanced. This conceptualization has allowed for centuries of dispossession, especially by positioning Europeans as experts who might recreate the imagined forested landscapes of the past and therefore improve life for the said desert dwellers. For the colonizers, the desert was a terra nullius, an uncultivated frontier open for experimentation of all kinds, offering opportunities. So in this new adventure, the frontiers people of Mazda City would be in charge, both abiding by the principles of the Abu Dhabi government and taking the initiative to produce a next generation of innovators. The frontier people would help Abu Dhabi ensure its survival after oil by substituting fossil fuels with renewable energies. According to this destiny, the students would take charge as astronauts, managing the successful institution of a new resource economy within an oil-exporting country. The frontier narrative not only reconfigured the passengers of Mazda City as resource pioneers, it also obfuscated the idea of resource finitude. While the Mazda project seemingly relied on and reproduced the acknowledgement that fossil fuels would eventually disappear, the eco-city promoted an infinity of sunlight and wind in responding to this verdict. Perhaps fossil fuels were going to be less abundant, but this did not mean that energy sources were finite and predetermined. Detached from the burdens of nature, the spaceship in the desert would journey through endless space, confirming the vision of a boundless frontier where new varieties of resources were soon to be discovered. In fulfilling its duties as an exploratory vehicle into outer space, the Mazda City project would challenge and resolve the problem of finitude. In its revised formula, Mazda City would constitute a testbed for multiple energy technologies that might later be purchased and used around the world. On top of this, Mazda City as a whole would be conceived as an exportable commodity, leading to the production of its replicas around the globe. The Mazda City design had to be mobile, traveling throughout the world. The eco-city served as a technologically advanced spaceship that could survive in a vacuum. Moreover, it had the potential to spread that technologically advanced environment in an undefined space and time. In other words, Mazda conveyed and emanated the promise to create that space and time for everyone else. Meanwhile, Mazda Institute students, the frontier people of Abu Dhabi's emergent eco-city experiment, remain unsure about the translatability of Mazda City into other settings. On February 1st, 2011, they gathered in the Mazda Institute auditorium to debate whether Mazda City is an elite enclave of sustainability unsuitable for the rest of the world. The graduate students who came to Mazda City from countries including the US, China, India, Egypt, Jordan, Iran, Turkey, and Iceland were struggling with such questions and wished to think about them in the context of a debate club performance. The team that perceived Mazda City as an elite enclave of sustainability argued that Mazda was too unique to be applied elsewhere. For one, Mazda City was very expensive. Which other country, other than the oil-rich UAE, would be able to devote $22 billion for an eco-city? Second, they recalled how this project had been put together to contribute to the economic diversification of Abu Dhabi and perhaps would not be financially feasible or meaningful for other countries with different economies. Mazda City was expected to help the UAE transform its brand image from oil producer to technology developer, to induce a perception shift, possibly attracting foreign investments or facilitating the creation of local startups focusing on renewable energy. Third, the political climate of Abu Dhabi was working in favor of Mazda City by providing prolonged commitment and stability. The government often served as a steady source of financing for the project. In this understanding, Mazda City would remain an island contingent on a specific set of circumstances only available within the UAE. Abu Dhabi's oil capital, its future economic vision, and its political environment were thus perceived as preconditions for launching the spaceship. In response, the team that defended the global applicability of Mazda City proposed that the eco-city should be understood and framed as a prototype. Abu Dhabi would shoulder the burdens of building the eco-city, and others would benefit. Every new idea is expensive, one of the students underlined. Think about the car. First rich people had it, and now it's spread around the world. Mazda City could become less expensive in an undefined future. It could be exported to other countries as a whole in the same way that the car and its infrastructures have been exported. In the meantime, the experiments taking place at Mazda would be learning experiences for students, researchers, and faculty, opening up global horizons for research on renewable energy, for eventual adaptation to other regions in bits and pieces. At the end of the meeting, one of the students approached me to express his dissatisfaction at how none of the students on the debate teams had actually defined what Mazda City was, or what exactly they expected it to spread around the world. No one talked about the personal rapid transit units or the motion sensors he specified, pointing to the technological artifacts that seemingly defined the eco-city for him. What would Mazda City pass on to the rest of the world, he wondered. What exactly was the future that the spaceship promised? On November 10, 2010, some weeks before the official opening of Mazda City, Daniel, a Foster & Partners architect overseeing the master plan, gave a talk about their design process. The students who organized the debate were in the audience. And Daniel's slideshow included a lunar image juxtaposing a space module with the gray lightweight cladding of the laboratory buildings on the Mazda Institute campus. The lab facades were composed of insulating cushions that, the architects explained, shade the interiors of the building and remain cool to the touch under the desert sun. Yet while the technological infrastructure of Mazda City was critical to the project, the architects also emphasized how they learned from old Arab cities in designing the eco-city. Daniel's slideshow, in fact, began with references to cities that had architectural principles akin to Mazda. Aleppo in Syria, Marrakesh in Morocco were among the cities that inspired the city's master plan, along with traditional districts within Abu Dhabi and Dubai and other cities in the UAE and the Gulf region. Many of these cities also had narrow streets, shaded windows, courtyards, and wind towers. The audience, mainly Mazda Institute students and researchers, listened carefully and examined the image that Daniel showed, a bird's-eye view of Shibam in Yemen, taken by George Steinmetz, a National Geographic photographer. So here's the image that he showed. A student raised his hand to ask a question, interrupting the presentation. But does Shibam really exist? Have you ever seen it? Daniel replied that it was too dangerous to travel to Yemen these days, so he had never been to Shibam, and added how he would love to go there someday. But sure, Shibam existed. This city, or this historical artifact as Daniel framed it, had been one of the primary inspirations for building Masdar city, an eco-city that strove to be located in the future, but that had its roots in a uniquely Arab past. By using representations of Shibam and other older Arab cities in architectural presentations, the designers of Masdar city looked for a context to which Masdar city could respond. At the same time, however, they helped serve political goals, assisting Abu Dhabi in achieving a centrality in the Arab world. In their presentation, Daniel and his fellow architects working with Foster and partners employed reference to the past as a material evidence and reasoning to thereby attain solid historical grounding for the project. By depicting their sources of inspiration, the designers of Masdar city formulated a credible trajectory for the emergent eco-city master plan and positioned it as a natural conclusion to urban developments in different parts of the Arab world. This imagery did not necessarily claim to be apolitical. Instead, by referencing, reproducing, and advancing this trajectory, Abu Dhabi acquired additional critical weight within the Arab world, constituting a new cultural crossroads. In these presentations, the old city of Shibam lost its social, political, and even material qualities and became part of the imaginary world of Masdar city. Did Shibam really exist? No one in the audience, including the architects, seemed to have experienced Shibam firsthand. Seen in this bird's-eye view photograph in the Foster and Partners slideshow, Shibam's qualities complemented those of Masdar. Shibam stood in for a mythical Arab past relegated to lost history and unapproachable geography. In this context, Masdar city not only served as a materialization of a displaced longing for this past, it also epitomized the expectations for a mythical Arab future under construction in Abu Dhabi. The official opening of the Masdar Institute campus, perhaps a metonymical representation of Masdar city, was scheduled for November 23, 2010. The campus, which contained laboratories, residential units, classrooms, a cafeteria, a coffee shop, a small gym, and a knowledge center, as well as open landscape areas between these facilities, like what you see here, was argued to be the first structure of its kind to be powered entirely by solar energy. When the day of the inauguration ceremony came, the students had important roles to play in it. And here you can see some students posing with Norman Foster, and these are the Icelandic students, and this is the then President of Iceland and the First Lady of Iceland. So a day before the event, they all received this email attachment with instructions on where they would be situated throughout the ceremony and how they would approach the high-profile visitors to the building, such as Sheikh Mohammed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. The document specified, you need to identify yourselves and greet the guests by saying, thank you for coming to Masdar Institute inauguration. We're delighted to have you here. We'll show you to the PRT cars. While 6 students were to welcome visitors at the PRT station, 14 others were asked to be present at the Knowledge Center, reading, working on laptops, checking books at the first floor of the library, so as to allow the visitors to experience the building in operation. The remaining 100 or so students would be stationed at different locations on campus at different times. The students were provided with a fact sheet with answers to questions such as, what makes Masdar city special, as well as reference points for potential conversations with guests. They would redeploy Masdar's marketing campaigns, this time through informal conversations, while making use of the half-working material artifacts on site as props. What they staged would serve as a natural representation of the future of Masdar Institute, with busy students absorbed in their work, reading, working on laptops, checking books at the first floor of the library. When presenting the Institute, it somehow made more sense to introduce that abstract future rather than showcasing the current state of indeterminacy the fledgling institution was trying to overcome. In this performance, the students did not only pretend to exist in the future, they also demonstrated the perpetual potential of the project. The science fiction or utopia that Masdar Institute represented was further enacted and confirmed through high-profile visits to the campus. By relying on a predetermined statement about the campus, the marketing department employees introduced the different research projects on site to their guests, which ranged from Hollywood celebrities such as Adrian Brody and James Cameron to politicians such as the then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, to investors interested in building eco-hotel chains or organic grocery stores. These high-profile visits not only help showcase the multiple advancements on clean technology, but also supported publicity campaigns in national and international media outlets. When the movie star Clive Owen toured the Mazda Institute, for instance, his comments ran under the headline, "Mazda looks like a city from the future," in the national English language newspaper Khaleej Times. Owen, who you see here, and who had starred in acclaimed science fiction films such as Children of Men, suggested that a science fiction film should be shot at the Mazda Institute. Many others saw the marketing and communications campaigns as portraying a science fiction project. In describing the city, many referred to films such as The Fifth Element, Total Recall, or Blade Runner. Margaret Atwood's then recent novel, Oryx and the Crake from 2003, was also considered a good analog. Most of these works are set in bounded cityscapes where life is impossible outside technologically supported zones. Soon, Mazda's promoters forecast life would need to be sequestered in enclosed and self-sufficient spaces due to climate change and energy efficiency. As a city built from scratch, Mazda offered a vision of technologically complex, eco-friendly, and enjoyable modes of living, and aimed to serve as a potential engine for economic growth. But the future that animated interest in this complex was at times dark. By the logic of Mazda's marketing campaign, the time and space of Mazda City was at once apocalyptic and utopian. Indeed, when executives working with Mazda City utilized analogies based in science fiction narratives, they received tongue-in-cheek criticism from reviewers. An environmental news website quipped, "Mazda City is bringing Blade Runner to the fore. No one wants to live in a city full of replicants, even if it's eco-friendly. Someone better call Deckard to fix this mess before it gets out of hand." The news website pointed out that many works of science fiction are critiques of totalizing environments where corporate power looms large, the police seem omnipresent, and large-scale social problems remain inevitable despite extensive rational planning. At the same time, Blade Runner signified a future that had already passed. Mazda City was relying on and reproducing an imaginary of the future dating back as far as the 1960s. It was not necessarily generating the fresh and innovative future its marketers promised. Anyhow, when they stop building it and finally give up on the clean technology cluster, Mazda City will probably transform into an amusement park, don't you think? Selim, a Mazda Institute student, wondered aloud. He was referring to spaces that were originally conceived of as futuristic communities, but later abandoned to constitute objects of amusement. Most famously, Walt Disney's Epcot Center, planned for 20,000 residents on a plot of land in Orlando, Florida, which became the site of the theme park Epcot after his death. According to Selim, in a few decades, people would come and visit the ruins of an eco-city, or what was meant to be an eco-city, where the ruins would signify not only decay, but also traces of an idea once pursued ambitiously. In this imagined future, Mazda City would become more of a spectacle, and its ruin would once again offer entertainment to its spectators, in addition to nostalgia for a past where the option of a renewable energy and clean technology future was still available. Yet the specter of ruination denoted how technological solutions are always so close to complete breakdown, as opposed to indeterminate potential. These narratives were very significant in shaping Mazda, but before closing, let's quickly take a look at how exactly the spaceship gets fueled. In this image, you can see the beam-down concentrated solar power station, which was a collaborative project carried out by MIT and Mazda Institute researchers inside Mazda City. And it relies on these mirrors to reflect solar beams into that central tower. So, as some of you may know, and this is going to be a repetition for some of you here, but I apologize, Abu Dhabi is perceived to be a perfect location for harnessing solar energy. However, according to Mahmoud, a 30-something Egyptian-born engineer at Mazda, this perception was not completely accurate. Upon finishing his PhD at an American university and wishing to be closer to home, Mahmoud had accepted a position at Mazda as his first job. As we chatted outside the solar power station, he stated that high levels of dust and humidity were blocking direct solar rays and causing thick coatings on the solar panels, diminishing their effective functioning. Although we can't fix this problem very easily, we found a solution for it, he continued. We call it a man with a brush. And here's an image of the man with the brush, and you can see the Mazda Institute building in the back there. So in Mahmoud's understanding, the man with a brush, a worker dedicated to gently wiping away dust and mud from the solar panels, became part of the picture only to reveal the infrastructural potential embedded within the solar panels. Man with a brush could perform a feat that extensive technological innovations couldn't so far handle, and was therefore fundamental to the emergent renewable energy and clean technology sector of Abu Dhabi. The man with a brush was South Asian, or perhaps from the Philippines. He shared a room with other workers in a labor camp outside Abu Dhabi, and he walked around the Masdar city site all day, cleaning solar panels. Overall, the immigrant labor force served as a most effective and essential resource for the materialization and functioning of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the UAE. Yet these humans who were making the infrastructures work were most often perceived as disposable tools. Masdar City attempted to help humanity fight climate change and energy scarcity problems, but its understanding of humanity was particular and selective. It did not include man with a brush. At Masdar City, oil would cease to be the main currency. Driverless electric pods would replace cars, and eventually possible environmental problems would be avoided through meticulous research and technological discovery. Relayed as a science fiction style narrative, the social and political injustices did not seem to matter much. In this context, Mazda remained an exclusive project that aspired to prolong the current social political conditions by making use of technical adjustments. It supported a conception of utopia or science fiction that did not take into account an improved future for the whole of humanity. The implication was that the status quo was already a best-case scenario. The producers of Mazda already inhabited this utopia, even though this utopia did not necessarily plan for the man with a brush or many others who were not included within its confines. In constructing an eco-city, they were building a limited notion of what humanity means and strengthening existing social boundaries. Perhaps we can understand the Masdar City project as an indicator of a general trend in green urbanism. Spaceship in the desert is grounded in the technical adjustments in Abu Dhabi's Masdar. However, it's easy to observe such technical adjustments in other parts of the world. Electric cars, biodegradable plastic bags, and energy-efficient light bulbs exemplify contemporary methodologies of engaging with energy scarcity and climate change, and they provide the piecemeal means through which humans seek to extend their lifestyles into the future while tackling climate change. Here, technical adjustments emerges as an ethnographic category that finds various expressions in different contexts and that guides living arrangements and shapes social possibilities in technocratic, typically anthropocentric ways along lines drawn by affluent nations. To see these innovations as mere continuations of an existing apparatus, however, is to underspecify the novel infrastructures of knowledge, technology, and governance, which elicit new tensions in the context in which they manifest themselves. Our current era is marked by contingencies that force us to question dominant modes of thinking about the world and to seek novel ways of attending to climate change and impending energy issues. Spaceship in the Desert shows how a green urban infrastructure of Masdar City fueled an aspiration for the manageability of ecological problems, where business models and design solutions were thought to resolve climate change without surrendering hopes for increasing productivity and technological complexity. The green products tested on site were instrumental for economic diversification in the UAE, generating a new brand image. Masdar City would produce and offer a status quo utopia, generating technological innovations with the goal of preserving the present during a time of ecological destruction. In this context, the future would be a thinly disguised version of the present. But in fact, climate change and energy problems should propel humans to challenge such ideals of technological development and economic growth, to pay attention to the alternative futures rendered invisible by the drive for infinity, and to cultivate new modes of inhabiting the planet. Thank you very much.
The original Blade Runner, takes place in November 2019, so it's...
I know. This is where we are. This is the moment. So it's
the past vision of the future. So, do you want to take your own questions?
Sure.
So I'd like to start with a technical question. They use solar power to generate energy, but can you tell us how they handle production of water and disposal of sewage in this ecosystem?
So thank you for that question, because it actually mirrors a lot of the panels that I attended where Masdar City professionals would present their work. and they would finish their presentation about sort of all the promises of the eco-city, and then someone like you would raise their hands and ask a question that would address water, right, sewage, and food production. So none of these were addressed in producing the eco-city. So water is, of course, desalinated water that's produced in a nearby desalination plant, which hopefully we'll see, and the sewage. There was a promise that there would be a wastewater treatment plant, but I don't think it ever materialized. And the food was being imported, just like all the other food that was being consumed in the UAE. So those problems were seen as externalities. So this is actually maybe another way of explaining how the definition of zero carbon is constructed, right? So this city was called a zero carbon city, and that definition was put together in many conversations with MIT, with the people from MIT who were active in producing the eco-city. And but they didn't know, when they said zero carbon, they didn't know where they were going to set the boundaries of the eco-city. So, for instance, many people who worked at Mazda City lived in Abu Dhabi or Dubai and commuted there. So, would their emissions actually be part of the city's overall emissions? So, did the city need to offset those emissions as well? Or would the city only be responsible for the emissions that were produced in its boundaries? So there is an attempt at sort of using different kinds of innovative accounting tools to make sure that the balance ends up being zero, right? But it's always difficult to do that because really, actually there is no outside. If the climate change problem is a global problem, so in a way, the emissions, if you by calculating those emissions or setting boundaries, they were themselves seeing how conceptually difficult it is to put sort of borders around the climate change problem and to try to solve it within a sort of a boundaried space like this.
So if this project was a test bed for solar energy, did it produce any innovations in solar energy? I've never seen anything like that beam platform before. Is that something that other
the beam
people are
platform
using?
is actually, there's I'm not 100% sure who developed this first, but it's actually actively used in Spain. So Transolar is one of the Spanish solar power companies that works in collaboration with Mazda, and a lot of the innovation that happened, I think, actually happened in places like Spain or California. But I'm not sure, I don't know exactly. I don't have access to the sort of how many patents were produced at Mazda City, or how many patents were produced thinking about Mazda in solar energy at Mazda Institute. So the imagination is that a lot of, since it is a test bed, and they were for instance, this problem that I described here with the sort of the man with the brush problem was something that was actively sort of being tested on site to try to sort of see what kinds of methods could be used to find a technical solution to that problem. So I don't really have a sort of like a quantitative response to that in terms of these are the kinds of projects that were finished and that these are the projects that were that had broad impact. But I think the project had impact in this way. So by putting solar energy on the map in the Gulf and in the Arabian Peninsula in general, I think it mobilized a lot of the other Gulf countries to start, and Saudi Arabia to start sort of building more renewable energy platforms, more solar power stations. So it became part of the conversation in some ways.
I mean, my impression is there's been a lot of technological advancement, especially in solar panel and storage. So the Saudis, as you know, they're building these huge solar power farms. Well, I don't know if it's because of Mazda, but it's because the Chinese and others are producing really cheap and efficient solar panels.
Exactly. So I mean, I'm not sure exactly like how much of that solar development is actually taking place here. But there is definitely an investment in asking questions about solar power.
So thanks very much for your talk. So I was looking at Mazda on the satellites to see what has been completed, and it looks very much incomplete. And so I don't know if there is anything to say about the fact that more than 10 years after its launch, basically Mazda is still like what 10 or 15% of what it should be. And also the name city might be, I mean, according to what you explained, it might be a bit of a misnomer, right? Because it seems that it's more like a suburban campus to which people are commuting, and you yourself were commuting back and forth between Dubai and Mazda, so you added like your carbon footprint probably to the equation.
Yeah.
So what can we say about it?
I mean, I think it's sort of one thing that's important to say is that at the end of 2010, the master plan, the rendering I showed here, was cancelled. So the project became, and when that cancellation was announced, the term zero carbon city was also started being taken off the books a little bit, and a new term was introduced, Mazda city, a city of possibilities. And that sort of transformation meant that Mazda city would no longer be sort of the smart eco city that it was going to be, but rather become renewable energy and clean technology special economic zone. So it still tried to sort of do different kinds of strategies to attract renewable energy and clean technology companies to the site. And there's still sort of like a sustainability guidelines, which whoever wants to build there has to abide by those guidelines. But they don't necessarily build according to the master plan that Foster designed in 2006, 2007. So I agree with you completely that the city idea is a misnomer at this stage. But the reason I want to take that seriously because that was this thing that was that shaped the vision of the eco-city when it was being put together initially by all these people who were participating in the project. And although there's been a lot of sort of conversations about sort of whether the city is a success or a failure, and all of the conversations have been sort of built in this sort of dichotomous way, I wanted to sort of do something a little bit different and look at how people see potential in the project. And so how do people actually understand the future of the project and understand their role in participating in that future. So I mean, yeah, I completely agree. There isn't much going on there, and we'll hopefully see what's going on there and get a better sense of its full sort of what's going on there at the moment in November 2019. Not in November 2019, unfortunately, but in February 2020.
So yeah, I have a follow-up question, actually, which is about the economics of the project. And so in 2006, if I remember well, so Sheikh Zayed dies in 2004, and then in 2006, the Urban Planning Council of Abu Dhabi was created. And so what's really striking is that these two institutions that were created at the same time are doing like things totally diametrically at the opposite, right? Because the Urban Planning Council is basically has for mission to create the massive suburbs where the majority of the population of Abu Dhabi lives. And I remember meeting urban planners there who were tired of like having to basically build Arizona in the middle of the UAE all the time, because that's what it looks like. It's massive American-like suburbs, where Mazda was very much the opposite, right? A self-contained city, green, and so on and so forth. And what's really interesting is that the reference to Shibam, it's a permanent reference in Abu Dhabi, right? I mean, like everything that looks different from the suburbs has to have a reference to Shibam. So NYU Abu Dhabi, the architect, Rafael Vignoli, is also making that reference to Shibam. He has never been to Shibam either, right? And I've been to Shibam, and I've been at NYU Abu Dhabi where I used to work. These look nothing like, I mean, it looks nothing like Shibam, right? And Mazda doesn't look like Shibam either. So it's interesting that like Yemen is sort of, all this happens in a kind of a 1950s, 1960s imagination of zoning and of the future and of spatial exploration, right? I mean, it's so striking how modernist that whole thing is, right? Where basically the future can be zoned in Mazda, and then the past can be zoned in Yemen. Yemen is the past. That's where the past is. And then in between you have the present, right? So but basically, sorry, I mean, for that long thing. But my question was, in economic terms, what types of investments has the city attracted so far? Because again, I mean, it looks like it's also a way for Abu Dhabi to kind of get some inspiration from Dubai by creating a free zone, or which is a Dubai thing, right? I mean, like having a port and then creating all these free economic zones. So does it mean that there is a viable future there? If not, for solar energy or water production, but maybe for investments.
Well, thank you for bringing up the suburbs, because Yas Island, which is basically right next to the neighbors, Mazda City to the north, is one of the places where a lot of the faculty members wanted to live, or a lot of the people who were working at Mazda aspired to own a villa. And Yas Island is like the suburb that they want, that complements this dream. So I don't think Mazda City can be thought, without actually thinking about the suburbs. So I think I'm glad that you brought that in. And also I want to say something about Shibam, which is like, what I find very interesting, especially now with the current war in Yemen, is that actually the production of Mazda City is what makes Shibam unapproachable, and in the past, right? So there is a sort of another kind of economic calculation there, that Mazda City is putting Shibam in that position, both metaphorically in these presentations, but also financially through its military interventions, all of these things. So I think there is a sort of it's almost like a zero-sum game, right? Where one of them is trying to sort of outdo the other. So I think there is actually something that's more violent there than I made it out to be here. So which I think is important. I mean, it's on the back of my mind as I'm thinking about this, and I think it's important to sort of just say here on the Q&A. So the economic function of Mazda City, and one thing that's important to know is the importance of Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund for the construction of Mazda City. So Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund invests in various companies around the world that it sees as being sort of like doing well, and in some of its investment deals, it has particular sort of articles where it says, if we buy X percentage of your company, then we would like you to come back and engage in technology transfer projects in Abu Dhabi. So for instance, the Sovereign Wealth Fund invested in Siemens, and Siemens came back and built an R&D building at Mazda City. So there are a lot of arrangements like this where, in a way, Abu Dhabi's own capital is being own oil capital is being used to finance developments inside Mazda City. And so that capital is bringing employees with it. So Siemens has a functional headquarters. People come and work there, and perhaps do some business in Mazda City, go to the organic grocery store, etc. So there's a sensibility that there's that this will be an economically viable model for the future. But I'm not sure exactly. And there's also the expectation that local startups will take on, and there will be sort of graduates of Mazda Institute will start doing more work there. But again, it's very hard to know exactly what kind of impact these have had on Abu Dhabi's economy. But I was just at actually a meeting just 2 weeks ago where someone who works for Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund made a presentation and said something like, when we look at measures of, say, percentages of economic diversification in Abu Dhabi, we see that the percentage that's non-oil revenues is always increasing. But actually, it's important to sort of look at how those revenues are attached to sort of oil-adjacent industries. So is there an action? This is something that the people working in Abu Dhabi are questioning themselves to see what does economic diversification mean, and how far from oil should economic diversification go if we're trying to sort of actually measure that and actually imagine a future where oil prices have fallen and where oil is not in demand around the world. So yeah, I think we'll get a better sense of it when we visit.
So it's a related question. I mean, like just looking at this and like thinking about the history and the particular time when this city is conceived. So like this is after the Iraq War. There's a lot of oil money that is being produced in the Gulf, needs to be invested. Easiest thing, invest in real estate, and it's not just happening in the UAE. It's happening in a sense all over the world, but like in the Middle East. And a lot of it is an investment in a future that can be sold. So you have projects that are designed and kind of as like these kind of futuristic projects that are going to revitalize or kind of change everything in a particular city or a particular context. And then they get recycled. So the construction starts. There are financing problems, so you sell it to another investor, and then nothing comes out of it. So I'm just kind of thinking, like, can we like kind of think of this as part of this, capitalist market where the creation of this fiction that this city actually is a zero carbon footprint city, that it's it's this kind of futuristic city that does not rely on manual labor and so on. Like that, this is really kind of part of like a larger trend in construction and real estate and the current kind of capitalist market.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, and it's not necessarily even only in the Middle East necessarily. It's I mean, I co-authored a paper with a colleague of mine about sort of Songdo, which is a sort of a smart city in South Korea, and Mazda city, and trying to sort of think about what are the common strategies that are being adopted in both of these urban design projects, and what are actually the common actors who come in, who are the LGs, the IBMs, the Ciscos, who all operate across the board in all of these city projects, and who actually participate in the making of these global urban futures, right? And so, and these these cities that are seeking to be non-contextual, seeking to be insular, isolated, and self-governing, and hopefully automated. That's the imagination, and that's why sort of the city's failure or a perceived failure doesn't matter to its producers, because the understanding is that the city is always in beta mode, like the software, like computers, is ready to mutate, it's ready to take on the next challenge. So, because for the corporations that are building these cities, that's exactly what they are, right? They're going to build the same city here, and they're going to do a version in Songdo, and then they're going to go to Shenzhen, and so the prototypes will develop. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the project is actually being built for the context that it's for, right? Where it's being built. So I think, and it's important to keep that network in mind while looking at things like this. So although yes, this project is in Abu Dhabi, it's financed by Abu Dhabi's oil revenues, but who are the people who actually participate in its production? And where do those people go once they are finished with this project? Where is their next project? So I think that kind of circulation is really important to look at as we're studying these kinds of urban projects.
So my understanding was that the conceptualization of Mazda City went through two quite separate phases. One is this like economic opportunity, capitalistic, consumerist image, as you said, that this is going to diversify the economy of the region. The other is that spaceship metaphor, and which itself goes through two phases, if I understood correctly. First, it's assessed in a positive, futuristic way, and then it becomes a matter of Yeah. Both dystopian and kind of seen as a joke that is like an old joke that we know where it ends. So how do these two connect to each other? What was the motivation behind the second image? I didn't quite understand from your
the second image is not a publicly
that was
shared
what I
image.
was
The
gonna
second
ask
image
as
is the
well.
image that I'm producing for you.
Okay, yeah. That was
So it's not
my
necessarily
question.
an image that's, the spaceship in the desert metaphor circulated heavily, never as a critique of the project, always as a happy sort of articulation of the project.
But even that happy part of it, so you connected it to the philosophical background of this securing this in like habitable human space from the rest of the world, vilifying the outside. Does any of it come with the public image of a spaceship in the desert? Or is it your interpretation?
So you're asking if there are people who are involved in the project who share my reading of the project?
Sort of. And is that reading connected to the critiques that then were raised, for instance, from resident students, whether this is a sustainable pattern, whether this reinforce social inequalities or not? Yeah.
I think there was definitely. I mean, I don't think there was a sort of like the kind of analysis I've presented here of the sort of the idea of the spaceship in the desert is not necessarily something that was shared in the way that I presented on the at Mazda City. But I think that doesn't mean that people didn't criticize the project. So the reason why I take this critique as the sort of like I push this critique in this direction is because I think a lot of the people who are part of the project voiced different kinds of frustrations about the future of the project, which is what the kind of imagination of like a ruined future, which I shared, or again the students who are part of the sort of the debate club, which I shared here, acting out sort of this kind of, okay, this is all the marketing we're hearing here. How can we like actually take this in, and how much of this do we believe in? And something that I haven't shared here, which also is important, I guess, to think about the sort of the spaceship metaphor, is the sort of the politics of the project that are actually sort of the real politics that are about sort of that impacted students' lives when I was there. So when I was when I first started my research, some of the students were invited to a sort of like a confidential meeting with the security advisor, and what happened at the end of that meeting, we later found out, was that those students, there were 6 students, were expelled from Mazda Institute, and the students who were expelled all shared this sort of a sort of a religious background, because you have to state your religion when you get a UAE visa, and they all said they're Shia, and so the UAE at one moment decided that it wasn't safe to have Shia in the Mazda Institute project or Mazda City project, and so they fired all the employees, and they also expelled all the students who were part of the Mazda Institute program. And so and these students had already been there for 3 semesters, which means that if you can actually do 1 more semester, you're going to graduate. But if you don't do that semester, then you wasted 3 semesters of your life at this institution. And so the students tried to go and talk to people at MIT, and MIT people said, this is a national policy, we can't override it. They canceled their visas. There's nothing we can do. And so this went on, and I've kept in touch with some of these students after they left, and I continued talking to them about sort of how they understood the project, and also talk to their friends, because they had built these friendships in at Mazda Institute in the 3 semesters they spent there. So these kinds of events, I think this event is important to bring in, because this is painted as this sort of non-political site, right? Constantly talked about through its sort of technical capacities, its possibility of sort of overcoming all kinds of disasters, all kinds of future challenges. But in moments like this, clearly political challenges did impact the way the project moved forward, and the students then in those moments said, okay, so this is actually this is an exclusive project. Only a certain kind of person can participate in this project. And who's that certain person is not very clear, right? It's always determined by whoever's in charge, and it's a flexible definition, and you're never going to be able to anticipate that definition. And so part of that astronaut is not only that it's a white collar sort of engineering student or engineer, but that also that astronaut also has to have other kinds of national, religious, or ethnic identity markers that allow that astronaut to remain on the spaceship. So I think it's not necessarily. So the reason why I'm sort of thinking about it in this way is not because people said, oh, this is just like a spaceship, it's insular. But because I think a lot of the events that I observed there were criticized by the students in a way that reflected the sort of the isolationist sort of politics of the project.
Just to follow up now on this theme of like the politics of the inside and outside the spaceship, where do the migrant workers fall in this scheme, right? Because they go inside the spaceship to do this invisible technical labor, but they're also not part of the present status quo world of the suburbs, right? They're not part of this futurist, modernist imaginary, and they seem still displaced, you know. And I wonder, how do they fit in this scheme and within the politics of the space and in this kind of...
I mean, the imagination is that in the future, and this is like the imagination is that the city would be automated in its future, right? The ideal version of that is that there would be no migrant workers. And this, so one of the chapters of my book is about the person rapid transit, which is sort of automated pod cars that go back and forth between Mazda Institute and the parking lot outside. And so they were, these pod cars were really important to sort of thinking about the project, and they were one of the sites where this sort of, the questions around migrant labor were clearly articulated, because the reason why Foster and Partners is said to have won this competition and designed this project in the first place is because they worked with a transportation consultant called Systematica, and the transportation consultant offered the person rapid transit as an option, and person rapid transit is actually also a technology from the 60s and the 70s. They experimented with it in the 80s, and for those of you who have read Bruno Latour's Aramis, you can remember it's the same technology, and Systematica said, let's just bring back in PRTs. And when the PRTs first appeared in Foster's sort of design proposals, the decision makers became very excited because they said, okay, this allows us to eliminate the immigrant labor from entering the city. So this allows us to sort of prevent them from entering the city even as workers. So it makes the city more hygienic. It creates this kind of bubble that's, much more, it fits the sort of imagination of the future that the decision makers came up with. So that's why the immigrant labor force is there, but is seen as a sort of a transitional. They have a transitional presence, and the ideal future is a one where they don't exist. So everything is automated the way the pod cars, everything would mimic the way the pod cars work. So it would be automated, it would be driverless, etc.
Hi, thank you. This has been really interesting. I had a quick question about local knowledge. You touched briefly about how the buildings mimicked ways that had been buildings in deserts and arid conditions had been for the past millennia. These like shaded windows and specific design styles. And when you were showing your slides, there was many images of people who looked like international community, people who are not from Abu Dhabi or from the region around it in the UAE. And I was wondering on what types for Mazda City, what types of incorporation of local people and local knowledge was used to sort of expedite the process of having to learn everything again about the area where they're building, and looking into forms and styles that have been used for like history as we know it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of that work was done by the designers, basically, as they were coming up with the master plan and with the sort of the design of the Mazda Institute building, and in terms of engaging with people from the Emirates, I think that engagement is very limited because it happens either at the scale of sort of the decision making, or at the scale of sort of admitting sort of new high school graduates to Mazda Institute to do not high school, sorry, new college graduates to Mazda Institute to do their masters there, right? So it's not like in the overall design of the project, I never heard of the participation of a sort of like a local actor who was portraying that kind of local knowledge. So a lot of it is based on the kind of research that that Foster Partners was able to do.
Thanks for the talk. That's great. I had a question. What about events to the past of the dates you have here, and one to the slight future of the dates you have here? So to the past, following up on Yazan's question, I'm wondering if there are any kind of linkages that we can think about or imagine with the Iraq War and the kind of sense of experimentation in reconstructing Iraq that in relation to what you've described. And to the future, I couldn't help but hear in your discussion of a ship, your reference to Blumenberg, your reference to other spaces, Foucault's discussion of heterotopias. And then thinking about Tahrir, just a month after November 2010 as this heterotopic space, and whether the event of these uprisings and the creation of these heterotopic kinds of spaces in the experience of the uprisings shaped the kinds of conversations that were happening around Mazda as a different kind of heterotopia.
What does heterotopia mean?
It's an alternate space that exists alongside the one that we normally live in. So it's not a utopia that's a fundamental break from what we currently have off into the future, but it's happening simultaneous to what we currently have.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think I mean, many of the people that I did research with were very pragmatic about those kinds of questions, and they would say things like, so people can't, the Iraq War, of course, is very unfortunate, but it means that Dubai and Abu Dhabi are going to be the new cultural centers of the Arab world. So it's partially part of this kind of argument I made in relationship to Yemen, right, where there is a sort of, it's an unapproachable geography now, but that unapproachable geography allows us to represent the future of the Arab world and claim a kind of regional centrality. So all of those the specificity of the conversations would always be molded and melded into this kind of imagination of how, okay, so this is what we're seeing in the world, which legitimizes our belief in the fact that this is where the future of the world is going to be decided. This is where the future of the Arab world is also going to be determined, right? So I think those spaces became very easy, sort of very easy to consume by the promoters of Masdar City. And of course, there's sort of the oil price dynamic, right? That always is in the background when these kinds of things happen. So how did those events actually affect the oil price? And so I think that's another kind of discussion that's always going on, right? So it doesn't even have the spatial sort of the heterotopian dimensions of those spaces. But everything needs to be sort of read in terms of how it impacts oil price. And this is not unique to Abu Dhabi. I mean, in Houston also, everything is read, and it's in the way it impacts the oil price. So, yeah.
So this builds off the previous question, something Pascal said earlier. I mean, there's a long history in the region of the spatial imagining of these future modernist projects and a new city, a new space set aside that allows us, without the burden of the present and the infrastructure of the present, allows us to leapfrog into the future, right? I mean, Nader's written on Neom in Saudi Arabia, where we're talking about possibly getting a briefing in Oman about Duqm, which is this new vision of a new port city, the new capital in Egypt, the special economic zones in Jordan, tons of them around the region. Where does this, first of all, where does this come from? At least within the region? Does this come from the 1950s and 60s? Is this a much earlier sort of vision that you can go back to? And how prominent is this in other regions? I know them, I'm less familiar with other places. Is this global?
I mean, I think Pascal would also be able to answer this question, but I think one of the ways in which it becomes like a prominent form in this part of the world is because of the presence of the oil town, right? So the company town, which gets exported through sort of the construction of sort of Aramco's oil exploration sites and all of these things, becomes sort of replicated in different iterations around the sort of, now it becomes sort of like a, well, it's a company town that's not for oil, but that's for renewable energy and clean technology. So I think there's a specific model that was created with Aramco that, Bob Vitale's America's Kingdom explains very well, and that model, permeated across this region and continues to take these kinds of forms. So I think there is a sort of a specific, unique history to the Gulf that can be traced there, but that doesn't mean that these are not global projects. I mean, there are many projects like this in China and Singapore and different parts of the world. And there's a book that actually looks at the sort of the consumption, production centers for these kinds of design projects and consumption centers. I mean, the book creates this kind of a little like an off binary of where these kinds of city projects get produced in terms of their conceptual sort of conceptually articulated and where they get implemented, and you'll see that there is and Dubai, Abu Dhabi, different parts of the Gulf become part of those consumption centers, but they're definitely not the only ones. They exist across different spaces for sure. But of course, and the designers that I worked with at Mazda had also worked in other kinds of projects like this. So the reason why they worked in Mazda was because they had worked in a Chinese eco-city before, and they had worked in a sort of like they had participated in a competition in a possible eco-city in Singapore, etc. So these kinds of stories are always in the background, and others had worked in like North Africa in like oil company towns as engineers. So even the people who have the necessary expertise required to get a job at Mazda City come from a background of having worked in different projects around the world. So I don't think it's unique.
So if I can follow up, in Arabic, do they ever refer to it like, do they ever think in terms of like Amsar, like the early garrison cities of the Arab conquest? Do they use that sort of language?
I've never heard of that, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I never heard of it.
Mayor.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for this talk. It was really fascinating. I just want to follow up a response to Pascal. Why was the master plan abandoned, and did something else replace it? And the reason I'm asking is because I'm curious whether that shift has affected current understandings of the city and these questions of success or failure. And then secondarily, I was wondering if you could speak to not how these large corporations that you mentioned Azan understand the city, but how it's understood locally in Abu Dhabi or in the UAE. Is it a point of pride, a point of criticism, because people know nothing about it? How does it affect these like larger questions of nationalism and how people view the state and the future?
Yeah. So there's the reason why the master plan was cancelled was because it was very expensive. So it's the financial crisis happened in 2008, and when I first showed up in the UAE, my goal was to look at emergent eco-city, not eco-city project, emergent urban projects in the Gulf, and actually the project I wanted to study was not Mazda City. I wanted to look at the waterfront city, which was a Dubai project that was being designed by an architecture office called OMA, and no one from waterfront city would answer my phone calls or respond to my emails, and so but the people at Mazda City were very responsive because the project still seemed to have a future to it then, so in 2008, and so but then slowly the people who were part of the sort of the financial team that put together the Mazda City project realized that maybe it's not the wisest thing to develop a 50,000 person city and expect to, find tenants for those 50,000 spaces, or maybe the city needs to be developed in parts and zones, and maybe that means that the master plan has to be abandoned, because then if you abandon the master plan, then you can offer better opportunities to investors who want to come in. And another thing that's important is that the master plan relied on the person rapid transit infrastructure that I just mentioned. So the person rapid transit infrastructure had to be built below a platform. So that meant that there would be a platform that would be built across all of these spaces, and underneath that platform there would be the PRT vehicles would basically be traveling, and they wouldn't thereby they wouldn't basically block pedestrians who were occupying the spaces above that platform. So the designers and the developers later realized that it's actually very difficult to build that platform like that, and it's becoming that it would make the city even more expensive. And but no one, these are all points of debate, right? So, for instance, if you ask the person rapid transit consultants, they would say, no, that's actually they're wrong. It's not that expensive. They could have done it. Why did they cancel our project, etc. So, but the cancellation of the PRT meant the cancellation of the master plan as well. What was the second part of your question?
How the city is.
How the city is perceived. Yeah. So one of the ways in which the city was always talked about was how one of the people who worked at the city liked to connect it to what they called the Sheikh Zayed legacy. And they gave examples as to how Sheikh Zayed liked certain kinds of birds, how Sheikh Zayed planted trees, and how Sheikh Zayed had a general sort of appreciation of quote-unquote nature and all these things. And so the city was connected to that legacy and said that this is something that Sheikh Zayed would have liked if he had been alive. If he had seen this, he would have really loved this city. So, but some of the people at Mazda who were more critical of the project told me, people always refer to the Sheikh Zayed legacy, but then those references actually are used to legitimize wasteful practices. So you'll do something like get a job at Mazda City, and you'll say, oh, I'm performing what Sheikh Zayed would have wanted me to do, but at the same time you'll continue to live your life in exactly the same kind of wasteful way that you did before, but you continue to think of yourself as a sort of like a ecologically conscious person because you, say, got a job at Mazda City. And so those kinds of immersions happened and were noticed by people who worked who were participating in the production of the city project. And so the kinds of, say, nationalistic ideas that were attached to the project were not very often celebrated by the people who produced the project.
I don't know if we have time for that.
We have time for one final question.
Okay, thank you. Actually, this question would follow up with the previous questions, because as you already know and mentioned perhaps, that there's a growing pattern in the Gulf particularly that to invite famous Western architects like Norman Foster, like Zaha Hadid, or like Graham Kulhas, and to commission them to design and construct the most extreme buildings, like the largest shopping mall in Dubai, the tallest building in the world in Dubai, like Burj Khalifa. So when you think about these projects, as you already mentioned that there are some other projects like this, but I want to think about, because why are they doing? Because of two political and economic reasons. And there's a form of competition among these countries in the Gulf. So when you think about this architecture of extremes in the region, how would you locate Masdar city within this political and economic context of competition?
I don't really like the language of extremes, especially when it's applied to this context. I actually want one of the things I want to do in this project is to show how it's not an isolated sort of, it's not like Abu Dhabi is like doing these extreme things, but actually all of that these projects become test beds where all these different actors, people from MIT, people from Siemens, people from Foster, etc., come together to experiment with certain kinds of ideas, which then they can take on to another site. And I guess in this context, what happens is that these kinds of projects emerge as possibilities for, say, putting Abu Dhabi's name on a map, right? One of the things that happened when I was doing fieldwork was that the Mazda Institute building, when it first opened, was featured on the front page of the New York Times, and it wasn't a good review of the building. It was actually some of the, it was a pretty critical understanding of the Mazda Institute building. It looked at sort of how it claimed to have different kinds of ideals around environmentalism, but it doesn't necessarily reflect those ideals in the lived reality, etc. But the people on the Mazda city site were ecstatic. They were very happy. They said that this was the first building to ever be reviewed on the front page of the New York Times, and it was considered a big success. Again, although the review was very critical of the project. So there wasn't sort of imagination that these projects would change the way that that Abu Dhabi in specific, or the UAE in general, was being perceived. And that the emirate would be on a map through different kinds of qualities, not necessarily its oil capital, but its experimentation or its new buildings.
So just to make sure that I understand it, so you would clearly categorize this type of city plan very different than Dubai's architectural innovations?
No, I don't necessarily see it as being that different from Dubai's architectural experimentation. I mean, there are different kinds of principles that are prioritized in this project versus Burj Khalifa, but the Burj Khalifa project also has the same kind of ambition of putting Dubai on the map, right? But and also has all. I mean, if you go and visit Burj Khalifa, you'll see that all kinds of the kinds of experts had to come together in order to make that project happen. People who are like sort of looking at wind patterns, etc., etc. So it's not. Again, there's a technical sort of challenge ahead, and that technical challenge gets resolved through the cooperation of different kinds of corporate entities from around the world, using again Dubai as a testbed for the next articulation of that project somewhere else.
So, despite all the dangers and fallacies of imagining the future, I will nevertheless encourage all of you to join us in 1 week for our next brown bag, which is by Mariam Alamzadeh, who will be talking about the founding of the IRGC and what she may or may not call the spontaneity, institutionalization of spontaneity in the IRGC in its early years. But please now join me in thanking
student who is working on new companies here.
Oh, nice. That's the whole point.
Right, but I'm doing this
Yeah. Thank you.
Getting the way.
Which the David says changes the meaning of man's
Because I don't
Everyone likes that.
Yes.
That's why I always
Yeah,
teach
I
them
don't
that
running it back.
because it's very memorable. Yeah.
Because then it slows down.
Yes. So, Josh,
I have to bring in
Hi, Amelia. Nice to meet you.
Then what if she says no, and then I take her?
Oh, really? Do you know much about
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't know the aspects that you're curious about. I think that I specialize in.
Oh, really?
Some of the links that I sent you.
It's a continuation of.
Oh, we're from Gökçe. Well, thank you so much for coming. I haven't read your book, but I was do you know if it's in the Brandeis Library?
I'm sure it is, yeah.
Okay.
And it was
Thank you very much.
Ben de teşekkür ederim.
eruption of Yugoslavia or